Welcome to 221B Stories, where every story invites you into a world of secrets and surprises. Grab your coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Sherlock Holmes and the Night That Shook Baker Street. Chapter 1. The Vanishing of Henry Acton. It began, as most of our cases did, on a night thick with London fog. The air, dense with the scent of damp cobblestones and coal smoke, curled against the gas lamps like the fingers of some unseen hand. I had just returned to Baker Street after a late house call, my overcoat damp from the evening mist, when I found Holmes seated in his usual place, elbows on his knees, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the flickering hearth. At first I believed him to be lost in idle contemplation, his mind wading through some unfathomable abyss of thought. But as I removed my gloves and turned to hang my coat, he spoke, his voice sharp, laced with an edge of curiosity. "Watson," he said without shifting his gaze, "do you recall a man named Henry Acton?" I frowned, shaking my head. "No, I can't say that I do." Holmes made a soft sound in his throat, something between a sigh and a chuckle. "Interesting. Most interesting." I moved to pour myself a brandy. "Why? Should I?" For a moment he did not answer. Then, with deliberate precision, he leaned forward and extracted a folded letter from the arm of his chair, extending it toward me. "Read," he said simply. I took the paper, noting the fine quality of the parchment, the faint impression of an elegant hand pressing the ink into the fibers. The message, however, was brief. "Mr. Holmes, it is imperative that we meet at once. A matter of grave urgency, something that should not be possible, has happened. Please come to 16 Alderbridge Lane at your earliest convenience. Henry Acton." I glanced up. "And this man is—" Holmes tapped his fingers against the armrest, a small, restless motion. "A respected historian, an archivist of considerable talent, or at least he was." I lowered the letter. "You speak as though he is dead." Holmes's lips twitched. "Perhaps he is." I frowned. "You suspect foul play." He exhaled through his nose, drumming his fingers once before standing. "No, Watson. Something far worse. I suspect that Henry Acton may never have existed at all." A chill ran through me, though I could not say why. "You jest." Holmes tilted his head, watching me with something unreadable in his expression. "Do I?" Before I could press him further, he was already moving, retrieving his coat and hat with the fluid efficiency of a man certain of his next step. "Come, Watson. We have an appointment with a ghost." And with that, we stepped into the fog-shrouded night, toward a meeting with a man who, according to every record in London, had never drawn breath at all. Before moving to the next chapter, let us know where you are watching from, and if you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another incredible story waiting for you. Chapter 2. The House That Wasn't There. The streets of London stretched before us, swallowed by an unnatural gloom. The gas lamps flickered weakly, their light stifled by the thick mist that clung to the city like an oppressive hand. Holmes strode ahead with his usual briskness, his coat billowing behind him while I kept pace, my thoughts troubled by the cryptic words he had uttered. "I suspect that Henry Acton may never have existed at all." The absurdity of it gnawed at me. Holmes was not given to fanciful notions. His mind was a fortress of logic, his deductions as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. And yet there had been something in his voice, a rare note of uncertainty, that unsettled me more than the words themselves. Alderbridge Lane was a narrow, crooked street in the shadow of St. Bartholomew's. The fog thickened here, swallowing sound and movement. As we neared number 16, A creeping unease settled over me. Holmes stopped. I followed his gaze to the space where a house should have been. There was nothing. The number 16 was absent from the row of terraced homes. Where we expected a door, there was only a narrow alleyway, choked with refuse and forgotten time. The buildings on either side bore numbers 14 and 18, the brickwork seamless, as if there had never been a house between them. I blinked. Holmes. Are we mistaken? He did not answer. His gaze swept the alley, his eyes flicking over the walls with rapid precision. He took a measured step forward and ran his fingers along the aged brick. His fingertips came away dusted with soot. "This is recent," he murmured. "Too recent." I frowned. "Surely you don't mean—" "The mortar!" he interrupted, pressing a fingertip against the seams of the bricks. "Less than a week old." I exhaled sharply, the night air thick in my lungs. "A house does not simply vanish, Holmes." "No, Watson," he said quietly. "Not unless someone wished it to." A chill ran down my spine. Holmes stepped back, his gaze sweeping the buildings around us. The windows of number 14 and 18 were dark, their curtains drawn like the heavy lids of sleeping giants. Holmes turned to me. "Knock on number 18's door." I hesitated but obeyed, rapping firmly against the wood. A long pause followed, then the sound of slow, deliberate movement from within. The door cracked open, revealing the wary face of an elderly woman, her features half swallowed by shadow. "Pardon me, madam," I began, "but may I ask, do you recall the house next door, number 16? Her expression did not change. "There is no number 16, she said. Holmes's voice was calm, measured. There was. A flicker of something, hesitation, fear, passed over her face. "No," she said again, firmer this time. "There was never a number 16. And then, before we could say another word, she shut the door. Holmes exhaled through his nose. "Curious." "More than curious, Holmes. She was frightened." He nodded. "Which means we are not mistaken." A sudden rustling noise from the alley behind us made me turn sharply, but I saw only darkness. I stepped forward, peering into the black void between the buildings. The silence pressed against my ears. Then, soft and distant, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating into the fog. Someone was watching us. Holmes's voice was quiet. "We are being observed." I swallowed. "Do we pursue?" He considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Number, not yet." He turned back to the alleyway where number 16 should have been, his gaze lingering on the brickwork as though willing it to reveal its secrets. Then, in a voice so soft I barely heard it, he murmured, "I wonder, Watson, if we should have come at all." Chapter 3. The Name That Vanished. We walked in silence. The fog had thickened, curling in tendrils along the pavement, swallowing the distant glow of street lamps. Holmes strode with measured precision, his gaze fixed ahead, his hands tucked behind his back. I had seen him in such states before, his mind threading through possibilities, eliminating the improbable, sharpening the blade of reason against the stone of the unknown. Yet tonight, something felt different. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked finally. He did not answer at once. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, more contemplative. "A house vanishes. A man is erased from memory. Even records deny his existence." He paused. "And yet someone wished for us to know." I felt the weight of his words settle in my chest. Holmes had always spoken of cases in terms of logic, the precision of cause and effect. But tonight there was something else beneath his reasoning, a note of hesitation, as though he were calculating not just an answer, but a consequence. "Shall we visit Scotland Yard?" I offered. If Henry Acton was a historian of note, there must be records. Holmes shook his head. Number. If we are dealing with a force capable of altering history itself, we must assume official records have already been adjusted. His lips pursed slightly, his gaze flicking toward the darkness behind us. No, Watson. We must speak with someone who remembers before they forget. I furrowed my brow. But no one remembers Henry Acton. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Not yet. We arrived at the British Museum some 20 minutes later. The vast stone facade loomed above us, its Greco-Roman columns barely visible through the smog. The streets were quieter here, the usual bustle subdued at this late hour. Holmes led the way toward a side entrance, rapping 3 times upon the wooden door. A pause. Then the sound of bolts sliding free. The door creaked open, revealing a man of advancing years, his face thin and pale, his spectacles perched upon a nose that looked as though it had spent decades buried in books. His eyes, however, were sharp. "Mr. Ludlow," Holmes greeted him. The librarian hesitated. "Mr. Holmes?" His gaze flicked between us. "Why, I hadn't expected you at this hour." "I do my best work at inconvenient times," Holmes replied, stepping past him. "And I fear time is against us." Ludlow closed the door behind us, his expression creased with confusion. "I don't understand." Holmes turned, fixing him with a piercing look. "Tell me, Mr. Ludlow, do you recall the name Henry Acton?" For the briefest moment, something flickered across the librarian's face. An instinctive reaction, recognition buried beneath doubt. His mouth opened, then closed again. He hesitated, pressing his fingers to his temple, as if trying to grasp a thought that was slipping away. No, I don't believe I do." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Think, Ludlow. A historian, an archivist, a man who sought the truth of things others wished to forget." Ludlow exhaled sharply, shaking his head. No, it's gone. It's like I almost knew it, but the moment I reach for it—" His hand dropped to his side. He looked up at Holmes, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then, very softly, he said, "They have already begun." I felt a chill tighten around my ribs. "Who?" Ludlow whispered. Holmes straightened. "Tell me, do you keep physical records of historical scholars?" The librarian nodded slowly. "Yes, in the restricted archives, but—" He hesitated. "Mr. Holmes, if this name is already slipping, then what do you expect to find?" Holmes did not smile, but there was something keen in his gaze. The truth, or at least the shape of it. Ludlow hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Follow me." We moved through the dimly lit corridors of the museum, past ancient relics and silent statues that seemed to watch our progress with unblinking eyes. The scent of aged parchment thickened as we descended a narrow staircase, the air growing heavier with each step. Ludlow produced a key and unlocked a door marked "Restricted Archives." Inside, rows of bound volumes lined the shelves, their spines labeled in elegant script. The librarian moved with purpose, his fingers trailing along the names. Then he stopped. A gap, a space where a book should have been. Holmes stepped forward, his fingers ghosting over the empty slot. "It was here," Ludlow swallowed. "I swear it was." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, describe what you see." I hesitated. "A missing book." Holmes's voice dropped lower. "And what do you feel?" I frowned. The question was odd, but I obeyed. I focused. The air here felt different, almost too still. The absence of the book was not simply an emptiness, but a void, a space that felt unnatural, as though something had been excised from existence itself. "I feel," I said slowly, "as if something has been taken, but not just from the shelf." Holmes exhaled through his nose. "Precisely." Ludlow shivered. "What does this mean?" Holmes turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "It means, Mr. Ludlow, that you must leave London." The librarian paled. "Why?" Holmes picked up a single scrap of paper that remained on the shelf, a torn fragment of a page. On it a single name had been written, faint, half erased, yet still visible. Henry Acton. Holmes looked at me. "Because, Watson, they will come for him next." Chapter 4. The Watchers in the Fog. The narrow corridors of the British Museum felt colder as we ascended from the archives, as though we had emerged from some forgotten tomb rather than a library. The dim gaslights flickered along the walls, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on the mind. Ludlow's hands trembled as he locked the door behind us, his breath unsteady. Holmes had not spoken since we found the missing book. His silence was not unusual. Many a time had I witnessed his mind retreat into that unfathomable abyss of thought, where he sifted through details with inhuman precision. But this time there was something different. His gaze had the same sharp intensity, the same cold calculation, and yet there was something deeper, a shadow of unease. Ludlow wiped his palms against his waistcoat, swallowing thickly. "Mr. Holmes, I must ask, who do you think is responsible for this?" Holmes adjusted his coat, his movements brisk, precise. "We do not yet have a name, but we know one thing." He turned to Ludlow. "Whoever they are watching." The librarian exhaled shakily. "What do I do?" Holmes was already striding toward the exit. "Leave. Tonight. Burn any correspondence related to Henry Acton. Do not speak his name again. If they believe you have forgotten him, they may yet let you be." Ludlow paled further. "And what of you?" Holmes did not stop. "I am not so easily forgotten." I hurried after him, casting one last glance at Ludlow, who stood frozen in the corridor, his thin frame trembling. Then we were outside, stepping into the thick London fog once more. We moved swiftly through the city streets. The night was unnaturally still, the air heavy with something I could not name. Even the usual sounds of distant carriages and echoing footfalls seemed subdued, swallowed by the mist. I kept my voice low. "Holmes, do you truly believe Ludlow is in danger?" Holmes's response was immediate. "Unquestionably." I felt the weight of that answer settle in my chest. "And us?" Holmes glanced at me, his gaze sharp. "We are already in their sights." Something in the way he said it made my skin prickle. Holmes stopped suddenly, his head tilting slightly. His gaze flicked toward the opposite side of the street. I followed his eyes, seeing nothing but swirling fog and the dim outline of buildings. "Holmes?" I murmured. He held up a hand. A silence stretched between us. Then, ever so faintly, I heard it. Footsteps, not approaching, not retreating, pacing. My fingers instinctively went to the revolver at my side. I could not see them, but they were there, watching, measuring. Holmes turned on his heel. "Come, Watson." I hesitated. "Should we not confront them?" His voice was calm, but firm. "Not yet." We walked on, turning a corner onto a narrower street. Holmes's pace quickened. "They are testing us," he murmured, "seeing how we react, how much we know." I exhaled sharply. "And what do we know?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Not enough." We crossed onto Baker Street, the familiar sight of 221B rising before us through the haze. The gaslight above our door flickered weakly, as if struggling against the weight of the night. Holmes did not enter immediately. He paused at the doorstep, his gaze sweeping the empty street once more. I turned to him. "Holmes!" Then, a sound, not from the street, from behind us, inside. I felt a surge of cold run through me. Our lodgings had been locked. Mrs. Hudson had retired hours ago. Holmes's hand moved to the door handle, but he did not turn it. Instead, He glanced at me, a rare flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Then, with one swift motion, he pushed open the door, and we stepped into the darkness. Chapter 5. The Intruder Who Left No Trace. The door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness. The air inside 221B Baker Street was heavy, thick with the lingering scent of tobacco and old parchment. The familiar surroundings of our sitting room, Holmes's violin resting against the armchair, a stack of unread newspapers atop the desk, my medical journals left precisely where I had last placed them, should have comforted me. And yet I felt an unease that had nothing to do with the lateness of the hour. Holmes stepped inside first, moving with slow, deliberate precision. His sharp gaze flicked across the room, absorbing details faster than my eyes could process them. I followed cautiously, closing the door behind me. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Nothing appeared amiss. And yet Holmes suddenly turned toward the writing desk near the window. He took 3 swift strides, his fingers ghosting over the papers scattered there. Then, without a word, he lifted a single sheet and held it up to the gaslight. A note. I moved closer, my pulse quickening as I read the words written in dark, deliberate strokes. Leave the past alone, or you will forget it too. There was no signature, no indication of who had placed it there, but the ink was still fresh. Holmes exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. He turned the paper over, inspecting the edges, the fibers, the way the ink bled into the parchment. "Watson," he said quietly, "describe what you feel." I hesitated. "You wish for a medical observation?" "No," he murmured, still studying the note. "An instinctive one." I exhaled, forcing myself to ignore the logical part of my brain. I let my unease settle into words. "The room is the same," I admitted, "but it feels touched, as if someone has been here, seen everything, yet left nothing behind." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely." He moved to the fireplace, holding the note near the glow of the embers. He watched as the edges curled, as if testing the ink's reaction to heat. Then suddenly he turned and strode toward the door. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To see Mrs. Hudson." We found our landlady in her quarters, wrapped in her shawl, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose as she sat reading. She blinked in mild surprise as we entered. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. You've returned rather late." Holmes did not waste time with pleasantries. "Mrs. Hudson, has anyone entered our lodgings since Watson and I departed earlier this evening?" She frowned, lowering her book. "No, sir. I've been awake most of the night, and I'd have heard if someone came in." "Are you certain?" Her frown deepened. "Of course I'm certain, Mr. Holmes. I checked the locks before retiring, just as I always do." Holmes considered this. Then, so softly I barely heard it, he murmured, "And yet, someone was here." Mrs. Hudson's hand fluttered to her chest. "You don't mean—" "No signs of forced entry," Holmes continued, his voice detached. "No footprints in the dust, no misplaced objects. Yet a message was left for us, in fresh ink." Mrs. Hudson paled. "You mean a burglar?" Holmes shook his head. "No ordinary burglar leaves warnings, nor do they vanish without disturbing so much as a thread." She clasped her shawl tighter, her voice unsteady. "Then, who?" Holmes did not answer at once. His fingers tapped lightly against his side, his mind already dissecting the possibilities. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, "Not who, Mrs. Hudson." His gaze flicked toward the window, where the gaslight outside flickered against the thick London fog. "But what?" Back in our sitting room, I watched as Holmes took a small glass vial from his shelf and dabbed a drop of clear liquid onto the note. The ink bled slightly, smudging just enough to confirm his suspicions. Water-soluble, he muttered. Common ink, but used in a method designed to fade within a matter of hours. I leaned forward. Someone left this for us, knowing it would disappear. Holmes nodded. A warning meant to erase itself, a message that by morning would not have existed at all. A chill ran through me. Holmes placed the note carefully in his desk drawer, locking it with an almost absent-minded motion. Then, at last, he turned to me, his expression composed. But beneath it I could see something else. Not fear. Holmes did not fear, but wariness. "There is something, Watson, that I have not yet said." I braced myself. "What is it?" He gestured toward the note. "I have encountered this ink before." I stiffened. "When?" Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. His gaze flicked to the bookshelf, where dozens of case notes lay bound in meticulous order. Then he said, "In a case I do not recall solving." Chapter 6. The Case That Never Was. For a long moment silence filled the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the walls, but neither Holmes nor I moved. His words hung between us, unsettling in their implication. "In a case I do not recall solving." I sat forward in my chair. "Holmes, I do not understand. How can you have encountered this before, if you do not recall the case?" Holmes, ever the master of composure, folded his hands before him. "That, Watson, is the very question we must answer." His gaze flicked toward the bookshelf, where his case notes were stacked in meticulous order. With a swift motion he rose and strode toward them, his fingers trailing along the spines. He paused at a particular volume, one bound in dark leather labeled with the year 1887. Holmes pulled it free and flipped through its pages, his sharp eyes scanning the text. Then, abruptly, he stopped. I leaned forward. "What is it?" Holmes turned the book toward me. The page before him was blank, not torn, not removed, simply blank. I frowned. An empty entry. Holmes exhaled through his nose. Number unerased entry. I stood, moving closer. The faintest impression of ink remained on the page, as though something had once been written there but had since faded, intentionally or otherwise. Holmes tilted the book toward the firelight, adjusting the angle. Slowly, the faintest indentations became visible. The ghost of letters pressed into the paper, as if the ink had vanished but the memory of the words remained. Holmes reached for a pencil, rubbing the graphite lightly over the page. A fragment of writing emerged, faint, fragmented, but enough to read. I leaned in. March 12th. "A man seeks my counsel. A historian claims to have discovered—" The words cut off abruptly. I looked at Holmes. "March 12th. Of what year?" Holmes's jaw tightened. 1887. I swallowed. "And yet you recall nothing of this case?" His expression was unreadable. "Nothing, Watson. Not a single detail." A sense of unease coiled in my chest. Holmes's mind was an instrument of near inhuman precision. He remembered every case, every clue, every insignificant detail that most would discard without a second thought. And yet, here was an event, a missing case, a missing client. That had been wiped from his recollection entirely. Holmes turned the page. It, too, was blank. Then the next, and the next. 3 consecutive pages, erased. He shut the book with a quiet snap. "Someone," he murmured, "has taken great pains to ensure I do not remember this case." A chill ran down my spine. But why? Holmes said nothing at first. He simply held my gaze, his eyes sharp with something I could not name. Then, at last, he spoke. "Because whatever we are pursuing, Watson, is something we were never meant to find." We did not sleep that night. Instead, we combed through every record we had, newspapers, letters, correspondences with Scotland Yard, all in search of a name that should have been written, an event that should have been noted. And yet Henry Acton did not appear. Not in the archives, not in the records of missing persons, not even in the deepest corners of our case files. It was as if he had never existed. Yet something told me, something Holmes would not yet say, that this was not the first time we had searched for him. By dawn, Holmes set his pen down with an air of finality. "We must take another approach." I rubbed my tired eyes. "And what approach is that?" Holmes stood, adjusting his coat. "If history denies Henry Acton's existence, then we must speak to someone who does not rely on history." I frowned. Who could that be? Holmes's lips curled ever so slightly. "A man whose business is secrets, Watson, and whose loyalty is to no record but his own." Realization dawned. "You mean—" "Yes," Holmes confirmed. He took his hat from the rack, his eyes gleaming. "We are going to see Mycroft." Chapter 7. The Man Who Remembers What Others Forget. The morning fog had not yet lifted when we arrived at the Diogenes Club. The great silent institution loomed before us, its facade austere, its windows glinting with the weak grey light of early dawn. Few knew the true purpose of this place. Beyond being a refuge for men who preferred silence to conversation, it was a hub for those who dealt in secrets, and at its heart sat Mycroft Holmes. Holmes led the way through the quiet halls, nodding once to the doorman before making for the private chambers at the rear. A glance from the attendant was all that was required. Within moments we were escorted inside. Mycroft sat at his usual place, a grand armchair by the fireplace, his considerable frame settled in a posture of unshakable comfort. His fingers rested idly against the armrests, his gaze flicking toward us with measured disinterest. "You look troubled, Sherlock." His voice, ever smooth and deliberate, carried the faintest hint of amusement. A rare thing indeed. Holmes did not waste time. "Tell me, Mycroft, do you recall the name Henry Acton?" A beat of silence. Then Mycroft tilted his head. "No." I exhaled sharply, my hands curling into fists at my sides. But Holmes did not seem surprised. "You answered too quickly," he said, eyes narrowing. "Too precisely." Mycroft's lips twitched, but the amusement did not reach his eyes. "A trained response, dear brother. If I did remember, you would not know." Holmes stepped closer. "And why is that?" Mycroft held his gaze. "Because some knowledge, Sherlock, is meant to be lost." A cold weight settled in my chest. Holmes, however, did not blink. "Yet you are not denying his existence." A pause, then a slight incline of Mycroft's head. "No." Holmes exhaled. "Then we are correct." Mycroft sighed, as if weary of the conversation before it had even begun. He shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering toward the door before returning to us. "You have stepped into something best left untouched, Sherlock." He steepled his fingers. "Henry Acton is not simply forgotten. He was made so." I shivered at the implications. "By whom?" Mycroft's expression did not change. "By forces that do not take kindly to trespassers." Holmes remained perfectly still. "And yet, you have not told me to stop." Mycroft studied his younger brother for a long moment, then gave a small sigh. "I learned long ago the futility of that endeavor." Holmes allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Then tell me what you can." Mycroft glanced at me. "You wish to know about the historian?" Holmes nodded. For the first time, something like hesitation flickered across Mycroft's face. Then, with great care, he reached into the drawer beside him and produced a single sheet of paper. He slid it toward us. I moved closer. The page was yellowed with age. The ink faded, the script elegant yet hurried. A letter. "To whomever finds this. If you are reading this, then I have failed. The truth is not safe." They have come for me, and soon I will be nothing more than a whisper in the pages of history. Know this, the past is not what it seems. There are those who shape it as they will, who erase what does not suit their purposes. They are watching. They are always watching. Do not look for me. If you do, you will find nothing. But if you must seek the truth, follow the ink that fades. It was unsigned. Holmes exhaled slowly. And where did you find this? Mycroft's expression remained unreadable. I did not. It was left for me. Silence. Then Holmes spoke, his voice quieter than before. And you did not look for him? Mycroft's jaw tightened. Some things, Sherlock, are best left buried. A long, heavy pause settled between them. Then Holmes straightened. And yet here we stand. Mycroft regarded him for a moment, then gave the faintest of nods. Yes, he murmured. Here we stand. Holmes took the letter, folding it carefully before placing it in his coat pocket. He turned to leave. But as he reached the door, Mycroft spoke once more. There is one last thing, Sherlock. Holmes paused. The ink fades, Mycroft said, voice low. But so do those who chase it. Holmes did not reply. And then we were gone. Chapter 8. The Name That Would Not Stay Written. The streets of London stretched before us, their familiar cobblestones slick with the morning's dampness. The city was stirring, its endless rhythm indifferent to the strange and troubling revelations that had just unfolded within the walls of the Diogenes Club. Holmes walked ahead, his coat billowing slightly as he moved with brisk determination. I followed, my mind clouded with unease. Mycroft's warning was not subtle, I muttered. He knows more than he will say. Holmes did not turn. That is Mycroft's nature. I lengthened my stride to keep pace. And yet, you took the letter. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the folded parchment Mycroft had given him. He held it up to the grey light of day, as if searching for something unseen. They erased Henry Acton, he murmured. They erased his house, his records, even our own recollection of an unfinished case. He lowered the letter. But they failed to erase this. The words sent a shiver through me. We continued in silence, our destination unstated but understood. Baker Street awaited, and with it, the work yet to be done. We reached 221B without incident, though the weight of unseen eyes pressed against my shoulders. Perhaps it was paranoia, but something about the morning stillness unsettled me. Holmes entered first, his movements precise as ever. The note from the night before remained locked in his desk drawer, undisturbed. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual fussing, remarking that we looked as though we had not slept, which of course was entirely true, before retreating downstairs. Holmes wasted no time. He retrieved his magnifying lens, spreading Mycroft's letter across the desk with methodical care. I watched as he examined every inch, every faded line, his sharp gaze flitting between details I could not hope to decipher. Then, without a word, he opened a fresh notebook and copied the words of the letter in his own hand. A peculiar precaution, I thought, until I saw what happened next. Holmes lifted the original letter once more, studying it beneath the gaslight. A frown flickered across his face. "Watson," he said quietly. I stepped forward. "What is it?" "Read the letter again." I leaned in, my eyes scanning the page. Then my breath caught. The words, they were fading. Before my very eyes, the ink that had seemed permanent only minutes ago was beginning to dissolve into the parchment, as though it had never been written at all. I turned to Holmes in disbelief. This is impossible!" Holmes did not respond. He merely held up his own freshly written copy. The ink remained dark, unchanged. "The original is vanishing," he murmured, "but what I have written remains." I felt a cold dread coil in my stomach. "Mycroft said to follow the ink that fades," I said. "But if the letter is disappearing, what does that mean?" Holmes exhaled through his nose. "It means, Watson, that someone does not wish us to remember it." I clenched my jaw. "Then why is your copy intact?" Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the desk, his expression unreadable. "Because I was not meant to write it." The words sent a chill down my spine. Holmes wasted no time in further tests. He retrieved different inks, different papers, and attempted to rewrite the letter multiple times. Each copy remained. But the original, Mycroft's letter, continued to fade until, within the hour, nothing remained but a blank, aged sheet of parchment. Holmes tapped a single finger against the desk, staring at the empty paper. "Fascinating," I exhaled. "Holmes, we are being played with." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "No, Watson, we are being studied." The thought disturbed me more than I wished to admit. Holmes rose suddenly, his mind seemingly made up. "We must go to Ludlow." I blinked. "The librarian?" Holmes nodded. "He is the only one, besides Mycroft, who reacted to Henry Acton's name." A sharp knock interrupted him. We both turned toward the door. A pause. Then another knock, firm, deliberate. Holmes strode forward and opened it. A boy stood there, no more than 10 years of age, clad in ragged clothes, a messenger. He held out a slip of paper, his expression unreadable. "For you, sir." Holmes took the paper, glancing at it only briefly before handing the boy a coin. The child turned and vanished into the street. I stepped forward. "What does it say?" Holmes unfolded the note, his gaze flicking across the words. His grip on the paper tightened. I read over his shoulder. "Mr. Holmes, you seek what does not wish to be found. You are closer than you realize. Do not meet the librarian, if you value his life." A cold silence settled between us. Holmes turned the paper over. Blank. No signature, no indication of its sender. I swallowed. "Holmes." But he was already reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson." I hesitated. "But the warning." Holmes's voice was steel. "Warnings are meant to deter." He turned toward the door, his gaze unreadable. "We shall see if this one was meant to be heeded." And with that, we stepped once more into the fog, toward a man whose very survival now depended on what we would find. Chapter 9. The Librarian Who Knew Too Much. The fog had thickened by the time we reached the British Museum. The morning's light was weak, strangled by the shifting grey mist that curled through the streets like a living thing. Holmes walked ahead with purpose, his coat drawn tightly around him, his expression unreadable. I followed, my pulse heavy in my throat. The warning had been clear. Do not meet the librarian if you value his life. Yet here we were. Holmes wasted no time. He pushed through the museum's great doors, striding past the bewildered attendants with barely a glance. I hurried to keep pace, my unease growing with every step. The corridors were emptier than before. The usual footfall of scholars and students was absent, leaving the air thick with an unnatural quiet. Holmes moved swiftly, leading us down a familiar path toward the restricted archives. But as we neared Ludlow's office, I felt it, a wrongness. The door to the librarian's chambers stood ajar. The light within flickered weakly, the gas lamp inside sputtering as if struggling against some unseen force. Holmes slowed, his fingers curled slightly, his only visible sign of unease. He pushed the door open. The sight that greeted us sent a chill deep into my bones. Ludlow sat slumped at his desk, his spectacles resting at an odd angle on his nose. His hands lay limply in his lap, his face ashen. Before him, scattered across the desk, were pages, hundreds of them filled with inked words, Yet something was horribly wrong. The ink was fading before our eyes. Holmes moved swiftly, pressing his fingers against Ludlow's neck. A pause, then a slow exhale. He lives. Relief surged through me. I stepped forward, gripping Ludlow's shoulder. "Ludlow! Wake up, man!" His eyelids fluttered. His lips parted, but no sound came. Holmes's gaze flicked to the pages on the desk. With a quick, precise motion, he lifted one. Even as he did, the ink on it continued to vanish, dissolving into the paper as though it had never been written. I swallowed. "Holmes!" Holmes's eyes darkened. "They've taken his memories." Ludlow stirred, his breath shallow. His gaze met mine, wide, glassy, filled with something raw and terrifying. I don't remember," he croaked. Holmes leaned in. "Try." Ludlow swallowed thickly. His fingers twitched against the papers. I was writing. I needed to write it down before." His breath hitched. "Before it left me." Holmes placed a steadying hand on the librarian's shoulder. "What did you write, Ludlow?" The man shook his head, his face a mask of frustration. "I don't know. I don't—" Then suddenly his gaze snapped to the desk, his expression twisting in desperation. "The book!" Holmes's posture sharpened. "What book?" Ludlow's breath came fast, ragged. "The one they took." I frowned. "They? Who?" Ludlow's eyes darted wildly. I don't remember." A cold silence settled in the room. Holmes exhaled. "Watson." I turned to him. He held up one of the papers, the last remnants of the ink barely visible. One word remained, just clear enough to be read before it, too, would disappear. A name. Acton. Holmes's fingers tightened. "We are running out of time." We helped Ludlow onto his feet. He was weak, but his mind, what remained of it, was still sharp enough to grasp the horror of what had happened. "Tell me about this book," Holmes pressed. Ludlow swallowed, his hand rubbing against his temple as though trying to conjure something from the void of his erased thoughts. It was a record, a private collection. Old, too old." His voice shook. "I found Henry Acton's name in it once. I remember that. And then—" His breath hitched. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And then what?" Ludlow's fingers trembled. "And then the book was gone." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "Vanished?" Ludlow nodded, his skin pale. "One morning it was simply not there. And he exhaled shakily. "I forgot it had ever been." A heavy silence followed. Holmes turned to me. "Watson." I met his gaze. "If there was proof that Henry Acton existed, if there was one last record of him in the world—" His voice was quiet, deliberate. "Then they just took it." The weight of those words settled in my chest like a stone. Ludlow gripped the edge of the desk. His breath was uneven, his eyes darting toward Holmes. You must stop, Mr. Holmes." Holmes did not blink. "Why?" Ludlow swallowed. "Because they will take you too." For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then Holmes straightened, adjusting his coat with the same measured calm he always carried. His voice, however, was steel. "Not if I find them first." Chapter 10. The Man in the Fog. Ludlow remained slumped in his chair, his breath uneven. The horror of forgetting, of knowing he had once known something but no longer did, had hollowed him out. Holmes stood at the desk, hands folded behind his back, his gaze fixed on the last fading ink of Henry Acton's name. "We are not safe here," I murmured. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "Number. But we must act before they do." He turned to Ludlow. "You said the book was old. Too old. Was it part of a restricted archive?" Ludlow hesitated, rubbing his temples. "Yes, a private collection, not meant for the public." Holmes's fingers tapped against his side. "Do you recall the section?" Ludlow exhaled, shaking his head. He winced. It's like trying to grasp smoke. Holmes gave a curt nod. Then we must find another way. His gaze flicked to the door. We must leave at once. I frowned. Why? Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. Because we are being watched. We moved quickly through the museum's corridors, our footsteps barely audible against the stone. The morning's fog had not lifted. Rather, it had thickened, pressing against the windows like an unwanted guest. Holmes did not break stride, his posture rigid, his mind clearly at work. I followed close behind, my pulse heavy in my throat. Then, as we stepped out onto the museum steps, Holmes stopped abruptly. A figure stood across the street. He was tall, draped in a dark overcoat, his face obscured by shadow. He did not move, did not speak. He simply watched. I swallowed. Holmes! Holmes tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the man's stance, his weight, his bearing. He is not an idle observer. The figure took a step forward. Holmes exhaled. Come, Watson. And with that, he turned on his heel, leading us down the street. We moved quickly, weaving through side streets, slipping into alleys. The fog worked in our favor, masking our presence, yet no matter where we turned, I felt it, that heavy sensation of unseen eyes pressing upon us. At last Holmes slowed his pace. He turned a corner and stopped beneath the overhang of an abandoned shopfront. His voice was low. We are not alone. I stiffened. Are they still following? Holmes nodded. And they are skilled. I exhaled sharply, my hand instinctively going to my coat pocket, where my revolver rested. What do we do? Holmes adjusted his gloves. We draw them out. Before I could respond, he turned and stepped boldly back into the street. The fog swirled around him, the gaslight from the lamps casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Then, from the mist, the figure emerged. He did not hurry, did not hesitate. Holmes waited. The man stepped forward until he was barely a few feet away. Even in the dim light, I could see him more clearly now. His face was lean, angular, his expression unreadable. His coat was unremarkable, yet perfectly fitted. There was no insignia, no sign of affiliation. But his eyes, sharp, deliberate, spoke of purpose. Holmes regarded him with an almost casual air. Well, he said, you've been most persistent. The man did not speak. Holmes tilted his head. And yet, you do not strike me as one who follows blindly. A long silence. Then the man finally spoke. His voice was quiet, precise. You are not supposed to remember. A chill crept down my spine. Holmes's lips twitched. Then I am most inconvenient, aren't I? The man's expression did not change. You should stop, Mr. Holmes. Holmes exhaled softly. A tempting suggestion. He studied the man's face. But I suspect that is not the real message you were sent to deliver. A pause. Then the man spoke again. If you do not stop, they will intervene. Holmes's gaze sharpened. They? The man's eyes flicked past us toward the fog-drenched streets. This is your final warning. Holmes smiled. Warnings do grow tiresome. The man did not smile. He simply stepped backward, dissolving into the mist. Holmes did not move. Neither did I. For a long moment silence stretched between us, the only sound the distant echo of a carriage wheel upon the stones. Then Holmes turned to me. We must move quickly, I swallowed. Holmes! Who are they? Holmes adjusted his coat, his expression unreadable. We are about to find out. And with that, we vanished into the night. Chapter 11. The Truth That Would Not Stay Hidden. We moved through the fog-drenched streets with urgency but not haste. Holmes was ever a master of measured pace. Too fast, and one reveals fear. Too slow, and one invites pursuit. His stride remained purposeful, his expression unreadable, but I could sense the calculations whirring behind his eyes. They know we are close, I murmured. Holmes did not break stride. They knew the moment we remembered. The words unsettled me. A force capable of erasing history, of removing a man so thoroughly that even the most meticulous records bore no trace of him. This was no ordinary adversary. And yet Holmes pressed on, undeterred, as if the very challenge invigorated him. At last he turned sharply into a narrow side street, where the gas lamps barely reached through the mist. We stopped. "Watson," he said, "tell me what you observe." I frowned, glancing around. An empty street, no sound, save for the distant carriages. The fog is thick here, but it is the same as before. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Is it?" I hesitated. Then I saw it. The fog here did not move. In every other street we had passed, the mist had curled, shifted with the wind, swirled beneath the street lamps. But here, in this forgotten passage, it hung, heavy, motionless, as though it were something more than mist. Holmes stepped forward. "It is here." I swallowed. "What is?" Holmes reached out a hand, running his fingers through the air before him, and then he stopped. A flicker. For the briefest moment I thought I saw something else, something behind the fog, a door, a house. Then it was gone. I exhaled sharply. "Holmes!" He turned to me, his eyes bright with certainty. "They have not removed it, merely hidden it." My breath caught. "Number 16. Holmes nodded. "The house that no longer exists." Holmes moved swiftly, producing a small vial from his coat pocket. With a flick of his wrist, he uncorked it and sprinkled a few drops of liquid into the air before him. A strange, acrid scent filled my nostrils. The fog shimmered, just for a moment, before shifting, breaking apart in thin, wavering strands. And then, before us, the house appeared. It was old, older than the surrounding buildings, its stonework worn with time. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. A sign beside it read "No entry," though the lettering was faint, as if it too were fading. Holmes exhaled. "It was never gone, Watson. Merely veiled." I felt a chill run through me. Who could do such a thing? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, undisturbed for years. The wooden floor creaked beneath our steps. The faint glow of gaslight filtered through the heavy drapes, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. It was as though the house had been abandoned in a single moment, untouched since the day it was forgotten. Papers lay scattered across a desk. A chair stood half-pulled from its place. An old ink-pot had dried in mid-use. Holmes moved with precision, scanning the room with keen eyes. "There," he murmured. I turned. Against the far wall, a single shelf remained, its books thick with dust. Holmes stepped toward it, his fingers trailing along the spines, reading the faded titles. Then he stopped. He reached forward, plucking a single volume from its place. It was old, its binding worn, its pages yellowed with age. Holmes opened it. A name was written inside the cover: Henry Acton. My breath hitched. His book. Holmes turned the pages carefully, scanning their contents. Diagrams, historical notes, dates, records of things long past. Yet something felt wrong. The ink on many of the pages had faded, just like Mycroft's letter. "They tried to erase this too," Holmes murmured. "But not completely." I stepped forward. "Why not?" Holmes's fingers traced the margin of a page, where faint, almost invisible words had been scrawled. He adjusted the light, tilting the book just enough for the writing to reveal itself. A single sentence. "If you are reading this, then you remember." The words sent a chill through me. Holmes exhaled softly. He knew. I swallowed. Knew what? Holmes turned to me. That someone would try to undo what was never meant to be forgotten. A deep silence filled the house. Then a floorboard creaked. Not from us. From upstairs. Holmes closed the book. We are not alone. Chapter 12. The Ones Who Watch. Holmes did not move. His breath was steady, his grip firm on Henry Acton's book. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. The floorboard above us had creaked once, just once, but it was enough. We were not alone. My hand hovered near my revolver. "Holmes," I murmured. He held up a hand for silence. His gaze flicked upward, tracking the unseen presence above. A moment passed, then another. A second creak. Someone was shifting their weight carefully, deliberately. Whoever they were trying not to be heard. Holmes exhaled softly. "They have been waiting." I swallowed. For us? Holmes's expression was unreadable, or for anyone who remembers. Then, with sudden decisiveness, he stepped forward. "We must see who dares to guard a house that does not exist." He moved to the staircase, his steps impossibly light against the old wooden planks. I followed, my heart beat a steady drum in my ears. Upward we climbed, into the unknown. The room was empty, at least at first glance. A desk stood near the window, its surface cluttered with papers. A bookshelf lined the far wall, thick with ancient volumes. A chair had been overturned near the fireplace, but no sign of the person we had heard. I frowned. Where Holmes held up a finger, his gaze sweeping the room. He moved toward the desk, his fingers trailing over the scattered pages. Then, with practiced precision, he lifted one. I stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The page was covered in writing, dense, hurried script. But the ink was— I sucked in a breath. "It's fading," Holmes nodded grimly. "Just like the rest." I glanced toward the door. "Someone was just here, Holmes. Could they have left through—" Holmes turned abruptly, his eyes flashing. "No." I blinked. He gestured toward the floor. Dust. Thick. Undisturbed. Except for 2 sets of footprints. Ours. No one had left. A chill ran through me. "Then where—" Holmes's gaze flicked upward. The ceiling. I followed his stare, my breath hitching. The rafters loomed above us, lost in shadow. Then a shift, a shape, and then movement. Holmes reacted first. He reached for the poker by the fireplace, hurling it upward with calculated force. The iron rod struck the rafters with a sharp clang, scattering dust and debris. And then a figure dropped from the shadows. I barely had time to react. The intruder landed in a crouch, their form obscured by a dark coat and hood. Holmes lunged forward, his hands already reaching, but the figure was faster, spinning away, darting toward the window. I raised my revolver. "Stop!" The figure hesitated. For the briefest moment, I caught a glimpse beneath the hood. A woman. Her eyes locked onto mine, sharp, knowing, unafraid. Then she moved. In one swift motion, she reached into her coat and hurled something toward the ground. A small vial, shattering upon impact. A thick, heavy mist erupted from the floor, swallowing the room in an instant. I coughed, stumbling back, my vision obscured by the unnatural fog. "Holmes!" I called. No response. Then, a window shattering. The mist began to thin. I blinked rapidly, clearing my vision just in time to see the window now open, the woman gone. Holmes stood near the desk, his jaw tight. He exhaled sharply. "She was waiting for us." I lowered my revolver. "Who was she?" Holmes turned toward me, his eyes dark with thought. "A keeper of lost things." We searched the room thoroughly, but no further traces of the woman remained. Whoever she was, she had come prepared, and she had left nothing behind. Except— Holmes paused near the desk, his fingers brushing against one of the few pages that had not yet faded. "She wanted us to find this," he murmured. I leaned closer. It was not Acton's handwriting, but the words, written in hurried, deliberate script, sent a chill through me. "You are seeing what you were never meant to see. But there is more. They are coming. Holmes exhaled softly. They already have. I swallowed. What do we do? Holmes closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then, when he opened them again, they were sharp as ever. We go to the source. I frowned. And where is that? Holmes turned toward the bookshelf, his fingers running along the spines. Then, with a decisive tug, he pulled one free. A hidden compartment slid open. Inside, a single slip of paper. Holmes lifted it, scanning the words before reading them aloud. The Hollow Archive, where erased history waits to be remembered. A long silence stretched between us. Then Holmes tucked the paper into his coat. "It is time we uncovered the truth, Watson." And with that, we left the house that was never meant to be found, heading toward the place where history itself had been buried. Chapter 13. The Hollow Archive. The name alone carried weight. The Hollow Archive. It sounded less like a place and more like an absence, something removed from the fabric of reality, just as Henry Acton had been. Holmes studied the slip of paper for a moment longer before tucking it inside his coat. "We must move quickly," he said, his voice low. "If they meant for us to find this, they will not be far behind." I nodded, still shaken from our encounter with the woman in the rafters. "Do you know where it is?" Holmes's lips twitched. "Not yet. But we are not without resources." He turned on his heel and strode toward the door. I followed without question, though the weight of an unseen force still pressed against my back. The Hollow Archive, a place where erased history waited to be remembered. I had the terrible feeling that once we found it, we would never see the world the same way again. We returned to Baker Street as the city's gas lamps flickered against the encroaching night. The mist had thickened, curling through the streets like restless phantoms. Though I could not see them, I felt them. The Watchers. Holmes seemed unbothered. He moved with practiced efficiency, retrieving a stack of old maps from his shelves, spreading them across the desk. I poured 2 stiff brandies, setting one beside him before taking a seat across from him. "The name," I said, watching him closely. "Does it mean anything to you?" Holmes did not look up. "Only that it is meant to be found by those who persist." His eyes flicked across the maps, scanning street names, forgotten landmarks, old tunnels buried beneath the city. Then, with a sharp exhale, he tapped a finger against a single point. "There." I leaned forward. The area he had indicated was an old, forgotten sector of London, one that had been buried beneath newer developments, its existence all but erased. "The underground station at Charing Cross," he murmured. I frowned. "That station is abandoned." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. The entrance was sealed, or rather, it should have been." We stood before the rusted iron gates of Charing Cross's old underground passage, the metal bars twisted with age, the remnants of a once grand railway lost beneath the modern city. The station had been decommissioned decades ago, deemed unstable. Few even remembered it existed. Holmes produced a small lantern, its dim light cutting through the darkness as he examined the lock. His fingers brushed over the surface, his keen gaze tracking the subtle scratches along the rusted metal. "This was opened recently," I stiffened. "Then someone else has been here." Holmes nodded. "And they did not wish to be followed." He retrieved his lockpicks, working with quiet efficiency. Within moments the gate creaked open. A hollow gust of air rushed past us, thick with dust and forgotten time. Holmes stepped inside. I followed, my pulse steady but my hand never straying far from my revolver. As we descended, the sound of the city above faded. The stairwell was narrow, the walls damp, the scent of mildew clinging to the air. The deeper we went, the more it felt as though we were stepping out of time itself. Then, at last, we reached the tunnel floor. The hollow archive awaited. The chamber was vast. It was no ordinary railway station, not anymore. What had once been a place of transit had been transformed into something else entirely. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into the darkness, filled with books, scrolls, loose papers stacked haphazardly as if history itself had been hoarded in secret. The air was thick with the scent of parchment and old ink. Dim gaslights flickered along the stone walls, casting long shadows that danced across the archives. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the shelves. Extraordinary. I exhaled, barely able to comprehend what we were seeing. Holmes, what is this place? He reached for a nearby book, its cover worn but intact. With great care he opened it. Inside were names, hundreds of them, each name carefully recorded, followed by a single date. Holmes's brow furrowed as he scanned the list. Then suddenly he stopped. His finger traced a single entry. Henry Acton, March 12th, 1887. My breath caught. That's the date we found in your erased notes. Holmes's jaw tightened. Yes. I peered closer. The ink here was darker, preserved, not fading. Then he existed. Holmes's gaze flickered. More than that, Watson. He turned the page. More names, more dates. But then the ink changed. The names on the later pages were blurred, distorted. The writing became erratic, as if whoever had been recording them had struggled against something unseen. Then, at the very bottom of the page, a final entry, half-written, unfinished. Holmes exhaled. I leaned in and read, Sherlock Holmes, March 3rd, 1895. The room felt suddenly colder. My throat went dry. Holmes, he stared at the page, his expression unreadable. That is today. A silence stretched between us. Then a sound, not distant, not subtle. Something moved behind us. I turned sharply, my hand reaching for my revolver. Holmes did not move. His voice was quiet, calm. They are already here. Chapter 14. The keepers of the unwritten Holmes did not turn. He remained still, his sharp gaze locked onto the open book before us, the record of forgotten names, the list of those erased from history, my name, Acton's name, and now his own. I swallowed hard, my fingers tight around my revolver. The sound behind us was not distant. It was close, too close. A slow, measured breath echoed through the chamber. Not ours. Holmes exhaled softly, the barest trace of amusement in his voice. They do not usually arrive so late to their own secrets. I turned, my heart beat a hammer in my chest. They stood in the shadows, 3 figures, unmoving, their outlines half obscured by the dim gaslight. They were clothed in long coats, their faces hidden beneath hoods of dark fabric, featureless in the flickering gloom. They did not speak. They did not move. Yet I felt the weight of their presence, a silent force pressing against my mind, willing me to forget. Holmes's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. You have gone through great lengths to keep this history unwritten. And yet, here we stand. A beat of silence. Then one of the figures spoke. Leave, the voice commanded. It was neither deep nor sharp, simply precise, like a scalpel drawn across the fabric of reality itself. Holmes tilted his head. And if we do not? Another silence. A presence, pressing heavier now, as though the very air sought to smother the memory of why we had come. You were never here, the voice said. You do not remember this place. You do not remember Acton. You do not remember us. Holmes exhaled through his nose. An impressive attempt. He reached into his coat and withdrew a scrap of paper, the torn remnant from Henry Acton's book, the only proof that refused to vanish. He held it up to the dim light. Yet The past persists. The second figure stepped forward. The pressure in the room thickened, suffocating as though reality itself were unraveling. I felt it clawing at the edges of my mind, something cold and insidious, slipping into my thoughts, urging me to let go. Holmes remained still. Watson. I clenched my jaw, shaking my head to clear it. Yes? Repeat Acton's name. The pressure grew stronger, stronger. I opened my mouth. The name was there. I knew it. But as I tried to speak it, the syllables dissolved, like ink fading from a page. I staggered back, my vision flickering. Holmes's voice cut through the fog. "Do not fight it! Speak it, Watson!" I gritted my teeth. "Who? Henry!" The air around us shuddered. One of the figures lurched forward, their hood shifting, just enough for me to glimpse something horribly wrong. A face, blurred at the edges, indistinct, a thing half forgotten, half erased. I forced the words past my lips. "Henry Acton!" A sharp crack split the silence, like glass fracturing. The air recoiled, the weight lifting for the briefest moment. Holmes moved instantly. His mind had been waiting for this exact moment. He lunged for the book, flipping pages at lightning speed, his sharp eyes scanning the words before the unseen force could take them. The figures reacted. One raised a gloved hand, and suddenly the ink on the page began to fade. Holmes spoke rapidly. "Watson, read what you see." I gripped the book, scanning the names before they vanished. "Henry Acton, March 12th, 1887, recorded as—" My breath caught. Holmes turned sharply. "What is it?" I stared at the final word beneath Acton's name. Erased. The figures moved then, the moment broken. A sharp gust of something unseen lashed through the chamber, sending papers flying, extinguishing gas lights. Shadows twisted. They were closing in. Holmes did not hesitate. "Watson, run!" I obeyed. We sprinted through the cavernous archive, weaving between towering shelves, our footsteps echoing against the stone. The air behind us rippled, shifting, the figures moving unnaturally fast, closing the distance in mere seconds. Ahead the entrance loomed, a dark passage leading to the stairwell. Holmes turned sharply, raising his lantern. "Keep going!" I skidded to a stop at the bottom of the stairwell. "Holmes!" His gaze flickered toward me, sharp, calculating. Then, with a sudden motion, he hurled the lantern at the shelves. Flame erupted. The fire raced along the parchment, devouring the brittle pages that held the forgotten truths of history. Smoke curled upward, thick and choking. The figures stopped. For the first time, they hesitated. Holmes was already moving, sprinting toward me, his coat whipping behind him. "Go!" We raced upward, the fire consuming the archive below. I did not look back. I did not need to. They were still there, watching, waiting. We emerged into the streets of London, gasping for breath. The city was unchanged, the fog curling lazily under the street lamps, the world above ground blissfully unaware of the battle for memory that had just been waged below. Holmes steadied himself, his breath even despite the sprint. His sharp eyes flicked toward me. "They will not stop," I swallowed. "Then what do we do?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze turning toward the distant skyline. "They have erased history for long enough." He reached into his coat. The scrap of paper, the last remnant of Henry Acton's truth. He held it up to the lamplight. "We rewrite it." Chapter 15. The Unraveling of the Forgotten. The city did not know what had just happened beneath its streets. The gaslight still flickered against the fog. Carriages rolled lazily down the avenues, and men in top hats discussed trivial matters on the pavements. Yet Holmes and I stood at the edge of something unseen, a truth on the verge of being rewritten. Holmes held the last fragment of Henry Acton's existence between his fingers, his expression unreadable. The slip of paper was all that remained of the name they had tried to erase. But would it be enough? Back at 221B Baker Street, Holmes moved with methodical precision. He cleared his desk, retrieved fresh parchment, and dipped his pen into ink. Then, with steady hands, he began to write. Henry Acton was born in 1849, a historian of considerable talent, dedicated to the study of suppressed records. On March 12, 1887, he uncovered something that was never meant to be found, a history that had been deliberately altered. The knowledge he possessed was dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was true. For this, he was erased. I watched in silence. Holmes's movements were precise, deliberate, as though with every stroke of ink he was restoring the very fabric of reality. Finally, he leaned back, regarding his work. "Watson," he murmured. "Read it." I hesitated. Then I took the paper, my eyes scanning the words. The moment I finished, something shifted. A weight lifted. A crack formed in the veil of forgotten things. And then the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the door. Holmes exhaled, pushing his chair back. "Right on schedule." I swallowed. "Holmes, if it's them." "It is." He strode toward the door and opened it. A single figure stood in the hallway, not one of the hooded ones from the archive. This man was older, his hair graying at the temples, his sharp features lined with age. He wore an impeccable black suit, his gloved hands resting lightly before him. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. "Mr. Holmes," the man said evenly, "you have interfered." Holmes smiled thinly. "And you have overplayed your hand." The man did not react. "You understand," he continued, "that there is no undoing what has been done." Holmes held up the paper. "But there is remembering." A flicker of something, an emotion too faint to name, passed across the man's face. "History bends," he said. "It does not break." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet you have spent a great deal of effort ensuring it does not bend in this particular direction." The man remained silent. Holmes stepped closer. "Tell me," he murmured, "what happens when the world remembers Henry Acton?" A pause. Then the man exhaled. "You will not like the answer." Holmes smiled. "Try me." The man reached into his coat and withdrew a book. Holmes's breath stilled. He had seen this book before. It was the very volume that had vanished from Ludlow's archives, the final record of Acton's existence, the book we had never truly laid eyes upon. Holmes took it carefully, turning the pages, and then as his sharp eyes scanned the contents, he stopped. I watched his fingers tighten against the binding. His jaw clenched. "Holmes?" I stepped closer, peering at the page. And suddenly I understood. It was not a history of Acton. It was a history of us. The book recorded everything, from our first investigation into Acton's name to our encounter in the hollow archive. Every step we had taken, every discovery we had made. The final entry was written in an elegant hand. I read it aloud, my voice hoarse. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson were never seen again after March 3, 1895. No record of their investigation remains. No account of their final case survives. Only silence. My breath hitched. Holmes remained utterly still. The man in black spoke, his voice quieter now. "You are trying to change something that does not wish to be changed." Holmes looked up. "And yet, here we stand." A silence stretched between them. Then the man inclined his head slightly. "Then let history judge." And with that, he turned and stepped back into the hallway. Holmes did not stop him. I did not stop him. Some things, once set in motion, cannot be undone. Holmes did not sleep that night, nor did I. We sat in silence as the hours passed, the book of lost things resting between us. Holmes turned the final page, the one that had spoken of our disappearance. His fingers brushed over the ink. "Watson," he murmured, "do you remember the day we first heard Acton's name?" I frowned. "Of course I do." Holmes tilted his head. "Are you sure?" The question sent a chill through me. I opened my mouth, then paused. When had we first heard it? The memory was there, but hazy, distant, as though it belonged to someone else. My pulse quickened. "Holmes." He exhaled softly, leaning back in his chair. "It seems we were too late." My throat tightened. "What do you mean?" Holmes gazed at the book. The ink had faded. The words, the record of Acton's name, had begun to vanish. I felt it slipping from my mind. The case, the names, the archive. Holmes closed his eyes. "They are erasing us." I gripped the arms of my chair. "No." I tried to hold on to it. The details, the truths, the moments we had uncovered. But the harder I fought, the more it faded. Acton's face blurred. The hollow archive dissolved into something dreamlike, something half-imagined. The book before us was blank. Holmes's voice was quiet. "It appears, Watson, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved." The last thing I remember was the flicker of lamplight, Holmes's silhouette against the fire. Then, nothing. Epilogue. The unwritten case. The streets of London continued as they always had. No one spoke of Henry Acton. No one remembered the house that had never existed. At 221B Baker Street, a detective sat in his chair smoking his pipe, his sharp eyes lost in thought. Across from him, his loyal friend read the evening paper, unaware of the chill that ran down his spine, a whisper of something forgotten. The clock struck midnight. Holmes stirred, his gaze distant. "Watson," he said suddenly. I looked up. "Yes, Holmes." Holmes hesitated. For the briefest moment, something lingered, something on the edge of his mind, just beyond his reach. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "Nothing," he murmured. "It appears I have forgotten what I was about to say." I nodded absently, turning back to my paper. Outside, the fog rolled through the streets, and history continued, as though nothing had ever changed. End of the story. Search fire.